I begin tonight by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tonight's event has taken a lot of organisation and support, and the Melbourne Law School would like to express gratitude to IP Australia, the Intellectual Property Society of Australia and New Zealand, the International Association for the Protection of Intellectual Property, the Licensing Executives Society International, and the International Federation of Intellectual Property Attorneys for their generosity in making both tonight's lecture and last night's lecture in Sydney possible. Ladies and gentlemen, these proceedings are being recorded and will be available online following the lecture. And can I give a special welcome to those who are following this lecture, which is streaming live online, the first time the Law School has done this. The Francis Gurry Lecture was established by Melbourne Law School and the Institute of Patent and Trademark Attorneys of Australia in 2009, in honour of one of the Law School's most distinguished alumnus and the World Intellectual Property Organisation Director, Dr. Francis Gurry. It's a wonderful opportunity tonight for us to be hearing from the namesake of this series and somebody who has, I think, more insight and more to say on these topics than most in the world. I'd now like to invite my respected colleague, Professor Andrew Christie, to come and introduce the speaker. Andrew is the convener of the lecture series. We're indebted to Andrew, of course, for his tremendous contributions to intellectual property, both through his own research and through his energetic pursuit of these chances to engage on intellectual property topics with the wider public. Andrew, could you please come forward and introduce our speaker?
Thank you, Dean, and I add my warm and sincere welcome to you as well. It's such a fantastic sight to see such a great number of you enthusiastically attending. When in 2009, IPTA and Melbourne Law School were resolved to establish an annual intellectual property lecture, we had in mind only one person, and we hoped very much that one person would both deliver the first lecture and allow us to name the series thereafter in his name. And we were truly honoured and delighted when Francis Gurry allowed us to do that. We had only that one person in mind because no one fitted the bill anywhere near as well, being what we wanted, that is to say, an absolutely outstanding Australian in intellectual property clearly of international significance, and we chose well. He is an overused phrase, but I'm going to use it. He is essentially a national treasure. He is Australia's best export to the world of intellectual property. There can be no doubt about that. And we're truly delighted that he's allowed his glory to reflect on this lecture series. And it's reflected very well, and you can see that in the past events that we've run in its name. After Francis, Alison Brimlow, President of the European Patent Office, James Love, IP activist and Chief Executive of Knowledge Ecology International, and last year, I know many of you were here for those lectures, including last year with Robert French, Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. Francis Gurry is strongly connected to the law school. He's a graduate both of our Bachelors of Law and Masters of Law program. We can't claim all credit for his education. He's also a graduate of the University of Cambridge, where he undertook his prize-winning PhD. He's practised law both in Melbourne and Sydney, in Melbourne with Arthur Robinson and Hedowicks, and in Sydney with Freehills. And in between those stints in practice, he was on staff here as a lecturer at Melbourne Law School. So again, the connection between Francis and Melbourne Law School is very strong indeed. In 1985, he moved onto the international stage, went to Geneva, took position with WIPO, and through dint of merit, went up through the ranks, holding very important positions: legal counsel, Assistant Director General and Deputy Director General, before, as all of you know, in 2008, the General Assemblies of the Member States elected him as the Director General. In less than 5 years as Director General, he's left already an incredibly significant mark on the organisation. He's re-established its integrity and its authority. Now, yet again and rightly, when people think of WIPO, they see it as the premier organisation, not just about intellectual property matters internationally, but about in and around the innovation space more generally. And he's also reinvigorated it substantially. already on his watch 2 major new treaties and many other initiatives and more to come in the pipeline. So his record to date is already a great one, and we're sure it will continue to be that way in the future. That's Francis Gurry, the person after whom we named the lecture, or whom we were allowed to name the lecture series. And I could stop there and say tonight's speaker needs no introduction, because of course, having introduced the person after whom the lecture is named, I've introduced tonight's speaker on it. But like most people who use that phrase, they then go on to introduce the speaker. And I'm going to, just with one indulgence from you, say one other comment, if I may, of a more personal nature about the man Francis Gurry that and I know many of you in the room have come to know over the years. I've been privileged to be acquainted with him since indeed his time here in the law school when he was a teacher. I was in his class. He would not have known me, of course, but I noted him very much. And later on in the mid-90s, when my involvement with WIPO grew, I had many interactions with Francis and have come to see him the man, and I think anyone else who knows him well will not dispute what I'm about to say. Of the many excellent characteristics he exhibits, I'll mention 3, intellect, integrity and humility. On the intellect side, I've never heard him say a dumb word, and I don't think there's anyone else I can say that about. And as soon as he starts speaking tonight, I think you'll agree. It shines through in everything that he says. Integrity, he's a very straight shooter. If he says he'll do something, he'll do it. He won't tell you things that he won't do. He's very honest, and that's a great characteristic to have for anybody, certainly someone in such a high level. And I've had the experience of meeting many dignitaries of high-level positions, but none who've been so humble as Francis. He's very comfortable in his own skin. He's very modest. He makes everyone he speaks to feel very comfortable in their skin. Those qualities, intellect, integrity, humility, I think it's fair to say are qualities that we as Australians would like to think the rest of the world associates with Australians. And what we have in Francis, being the highest ranking official in the UN system, is somebody who exemplifies them to an extraordinary degree. And for that alone, I think we should also be extremely proud. So all I now need to do is ask you to join with me in welcoming to the podium to deliver the 5th Francis Gurry Lecture on Intellectual Property on the topic of rethinking the role of intellectual property, the very man himself, Francis Gurry.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you, Carolyn. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. It's really a privilege to be here, and thank you all for coming tonight. Andrew has been very flattering. I tell you, there is an explanation for it. Some of you may be aware of this or have heard this story, but as he said, I did teach him, and then some years passed in which we lost contact, and then we re-established contact, and we saw each other again, and Andrew came and introduced himself, and he said, you taught me at Melbourne Law School. And I said, oh, is that right? What did I teach you? And he said, well, I can't remember. So he's been making up for it ever since, you see. So let me thank the organisers. Andrew has himself, as Carolyn has said, played an instrumental role in this lecture series, and thanks to Andrew and his energy. Thanks to the Melbourne Law School, thanks to IPTA, and thanks to all the other co-sponsors of this lecture series. What I would like to do tonight, or the argument really that I'd like to present to you, is that the context in which intellectual property operates in the contemporary world is vastly different from that in which IP was born. And that new context has changed the position of intellectual property in the economy, and it's changed it in society. And I think it should cause us to rethink the role that we give to intellectual property. And the way I'd like to do that is to start by recalling some of the traditional explanations for why we have intellectual property. Then I would like to outline what I think are some of the major changes that have occurred in the world that account for the new context or environment in which IP is operating. And then to say what the consequences of that are for IP, for its role, how we now should perhaps conceive it, and then to focus on what I think are the three questions that are going to animate the world of intellectual property in the future, in this new environment and in this new role. And if there's time, perhaps something to say about the environment in which policy is made for intellectual property. So let me start with the traditional justifications for why we have intellectual property. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with these, so let me go through them very briefly. One set of explanations arises from the, as the economists say, the non-rivalrous nature of information or knowledge. The fact that information is a private good in production, that is, it costs money and human resources to produce, but once produced, it's a public good. It's a public good in consumption. That is to say that one person may use it without any loss of enjoyment of the use by another person. And that characteristic of information was noticed in the 6th century, actually, in Ireland, by the monk Columcille, who was lent a Bible by another monk, Finian, and Columcille copied the illuminations or the drawings on the Bible of Finian. And this incensed Finian, and he took him to the king and accused him of theft. And the king, at the time, King Diarmuid, asked Columcille about this, and Columcille said, well, I haven't stolen anything. He still has his drawings, he still has his illuminations. And in fact, his book is none the worse for my having copied the drawings. And in dismissing that defence, the King of Ireland ushered copyright into the world by saying, to every cow her calf, and to every book its copy. So what IP does, of course, is it creates a policy restriction on the free use, otherwise, of information that's been produced. And it's a policy restriction in the form of exclusive rights to the commercial use of the newly available knowledge, and that thereby creates an economic incentive to invest in the production or the creation of new knowledge, and it also provides a safe passage through the long and often lonely march of an idea from conception to commercial application as a new product or process or service. That first set of explanations for IP applies to all of those IP rights that concern the creation of new knowledge, so patents, trade secrets, plant variety rights, designs, copyright, and also rights in confidential information. Now, as was suggested or is suggested by the moral indignation of Finian in having his drawings copied, there is also an ethical basis to intellectual property, and that's expressed in Article 27.2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. And that ethical basis, of course, applies to most intellectual property rights. It has a long history, a long social history, and that's evidenced in the negative connotation that we give to words like plagiarism or copying or cheating or copycat. The other two reasons for having intellectual property are rather specific to particular intellectual property rights. Notably, in the third place, we have, in the case of the patent system, a justification being getting technology and knowledge out into the open. And the best illustration of this is the saxophone, actually. The saxophone is the only instrument in the orchestra which was patented, and it was patented in 1846 by Adolphe Sax in France. And in the course of the next 70 years or so, some 14 other patents were taken out on the saxophone concerning the mouthpiece, improvement in the mouthpiece, the mechanism of the saxophone, the alto sax, different varieties of sax. And they were taken out by Adolphe Sax and by people that we would now call competitors. And it's very instructive, I think, to compare that with the evolution of violins. Because in the case of violins, the very best violins that have ever been made in the world were made in the 17th century, in the early 18th century in Cremona in Italy. But they were made by families who transmitted knowledge in family-based secrecy. It was a secret held within the family, and the consequence of that is that the world's very best violins, Stradivari, Guarneri and others, we still don't know how they were made because the secret of their manufacture is lost in the passage of the knowledge within the families. In the case of trademarks, finally, there's a fourth justification, another justification. It's for trademarks, for geographical indications, and for passing off or unfair competition, depending on how you conceptualise it. And that is market order, really, or creating order in the market. Messaging and signalling, of course, between, on the one hand, producers and entrepreneurs, and on the other hand, consumers and the general public, are indispensable for ensuring correct information and for avoiding deception and fraud. And in distributed markets, in the globalised economy, this function is only reinforced. So those are the traditional explanations for intellectual property, and I think that they remain entirely valid. However, I think that a number of changes have occurred which should cause us to add certain functions to the job description of intellectual property. And those changes, which I'd like now to briefly describe, are the economic shift from tangible to intangible, the geopolitical shift from west to east, and the political shift from state to non-state. So let me deal with each of those briefly, if I may. The first of them, the rise of intangibles, and I'll just see if I can make this function. So here is one representation of it, and you can criticise it for various reasons, but there's an essential truth in it. So it's the distribution of assets in the top 500 companies in the Standard & Poor's Index in the United States of America, and you see that in 1978, it's about 95% tangible assets and 5% intangible. And then you get to 2010, it's about 20% tangible and 80% intangible assets. So that enormous shift, in fact, the centre of wealth creation has shifted from physical capital on the one hand and tangible assets on the one hand to intellectual capital and intangible assets on the other hand, or what the OECD now calls knowledge-based capital. And that's one measure I've given you. There are various other measures that are available. For example, in the United States of America and in certain other advanced countries, there is more investment annually in knowledge-based capital than there is in physical capital. And certainly in the advanced countries, the rate of increase in investment in knowledge-based capital is higher than the rate of increase in investment in physical capital. Now that shift brings with it, of course, a change in the focus of competition. And competition is now increasingly targeted at the competitive advantage that is given by knowledge-based capital. And that's why, after all, we're seeing increased rates of investment in knowledge-based capital for that competitive advantage. And that competitive advantage that's conferred by knowledge-based capital is expressed as innovation, of course. And we understand that term in a very comprehensive manner these days to include not just technology, but design, marketing, and all the other elements that go into a new product or service. Now, innovation is, of course, in the contemporary world, the key to economic and, by the way, military success, and it's perceived as such. For example, the Wall Street Journal in April last year, published a survey in which it looked at all of the annual and quarterly reports that had been filed by corporations with the Securities and Exchange Commission in the preceding 12 months. And it found that the word innovation had been mentioned 33,500 times in those reports. So this is why one economist has said there's an innovation fetish, actually, around. And in the preceding 6 months, 255 new books have been published with the title innovation, with the word innovation in the title. So what intellectual property does, of course, is to secure that competitive advantage that is given by innovation, and that translates into enormous economic value for which intellectual property is the custodian. Now here is one survey that's done. It's done by the Department of Commerce in the United States of America last year, in which they sought to measure the impact of IP, and they found that the IP-intensive industries were responsible for basically $5 trillion in added value, or 35% of GDP, and they're responsible for 27 million jobs, or basically 19% of all employment. And awareness of that value that is captured by intellectual property accounts for, of course, the rise in demand for intellectual property titles that we've seen. And there you see that over the period of the last 15 years, basically the number of patent applications filed annually worldwide has doubled, from 1 million to 2 million, a little above it. The number of trademark applications has doubled from about 2 million to 4 million worldwide. And in the case of industrial designs, the number of applications has trebled, actually, to about 700,000. So now, that's so much for the first main shift. Let me move to the second main shift, which I think is the geopolitical shift from west to east. And of course, here we know, of course, that the centre of economic gravity is shifting, and with it, at a different pace, the centre of technological gravity as well. And naturally, you know, we're not sure how long this movement will go on for. We're not sure where the centre will end up. We're not sure whether there will be a centre or some other geometric formation. But what we do know is that a shift is underway of the likes that we haven't seen for about several hundred years, a massive shift. There are many indicators of it, but I just want to focus on the production of knowledge and the production of technology, our area. And let me give you 3 indicators briefly. One concerning an input to production of knowledge and technology, and 2 concerning outputs. So in terms of input, of course research and development is the main input for the production of new knowledge. And now we see that China is in absolute terms the second largest investor in research and development in the world. Second largest in absolute terms to the United States of America. The third largest is Japan. And Asian countries at the end of the 20th century accounted for 24% of worldwide research and development. 10 years later, in 2009, they accounted for 32%, 24 to 32% of world research and development. In terms of outputs, now, what we've seen, of course, in the first decade of the 21st century is that the production of scientific articles, first of all, by Asia has risen at a rate that is vastly in excess of the increase in production in the advanced economies. And as a report of the Royal Society said in 2011, it stated that these scientific league tables are not just about prestige, they are a barometer of a country's ability to compete on the international stage. And the picture is even clearer in the case of technology, and I use there the measure of international patent applications filed with WIPO in the PCT, and there we see the red line is Asia, and we see that Asia, and in particular it is Japan in this order of magnitude, Japan, China and the Republic of Korea, now account for 38.8% of all international patent applications filed. which is much more than the 32% of Europe or the 28% of the United States of America. And that's the Chinese dragon you see there coming up to be, in a very short space of time, the largest patent office in the world. And some 25% of all patent applications in the world are filed in China. Okay, so that is a very clear tendency that we see. And then finally, let me move to the third shift, which is the empowerment of non-state actors. And this is what is called by some commentators, Joseph Nye, for example, the diffusion of power from the state across society. And there we see that this empowerment of non-state actors has been brought about by the internet, first of all, and then, of course, by social media more recently. And what the internet did is, first of all, it busted the state's monopoly on information. You know, one of the reasons why states made policy is because they had all the information to make policy. Well, now that's no longer the case, and big data is only going to accentuate, if anything, that particular phenomenon. It also, the internet, created networks of all conceivable sorts. Networks, you're all familiar with this, of course, but networks, political networks, social networks, cultural networks, scientific networks, technological networks. So in short, what it has done is created a shift in the access to information and to knowledge, and in the capacity to use knowledge for all sorts of purposes. Now, there are many examples of this, but let me give you one example of this shift in power, which is in the field of intellectual property, and that is the events that occurred on January 18, 2012. On January 18, 2012, there was an orchestrated series of events with respect to two pieces of legislation in the United States Congress, namely SOPA and PIPA. SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, and PIPA, the Protect Intellectual Property Act. Now, those bills had been introduced to the Congress with bipartisan support, and normally, with bipartisan support, they were assured of passage. But the protests actually caused the bills to be shelved. And here's what happened. The protests involved 115,000 websites closing access to all or much of their content, and participating websites included Wikipedia, which went dark, Google, which blacked out its logo, Reddit, Twitter, and Tumblr. 162 million people experienced the blackout of Wikipedia. Google put an online petition in protest on January 18 online, and in the first morning, 4.5 million people signed up to it. There were 2.4 million tweets, SOPA-related tweets, that were sent in the first 16 hours of January 18, and the top 5 trending terms on Twitter that day were SOPA, Stop SOPA, PIPA, Tell Congress, and Facts Without Wikipedia. And in addition, and I don't suggest that this is in any way part of an orchestrated or coordinated campaign with anyone else, but the group Anonymous knocked out the websites of the FBI, the United States Department of Justice, and several entertainment industry sites as retribution for anti-piracy efforts by both the government and the entertainment industry. So not only did the Department of Justice and the FBI get attacked, but reportedly also the Recording Industry of America, the Motion Pictures Association of America, Universal Music, and BMI websites. And some Anonymous said that it was their largest ever attack, with 5,600 participants. Okay, so those three shifts of tangible to intangible, west to east, and then I think state to non-state, have occurred against the backdrop of globalisation, of course. That is the rise of free, open, and interconnected markets and global value chains. And that has been driven, of course, by reduced trade barriers, improve transportation, improve communication, improve telecommunication. And there are numerous byproducts to the very complex phenomenon of globalization. But let me just mention for present purposes that some of the byproducts of that are global awareness and use of technologies. Now, there are 6.8 billion mobile telephone subscriptions now in the world. So it's rare for a technology not to be part of a global consciousness. First of all, global fashions and trends and global consumption of entertainment. So as of the time when I wrote this paper, the music video Gangnam Style by Psy had been viewed 1.7 billion times on YouTube. And it thus surpassed Julian Bieber's Baby as the site's most watched video. Okay, so where does all of this leave King Diarmuid and his cow? Well, I don't think any of those developments that I've described invalidate the traditional explanations for intellectual property, but I do think that they should cause us to look at intellectual property in a much more sophisticated manner than we have traditionally. And I'd like to suggest that intellectual property's mission, actually, and it's a rather grandiose one, but I think it's correct, intellectual property's mission, it's about the whole way in which knowledge and culture are produced, distributed, and consumed in an economy in which the centre of wealth creation is intangible or intellectual capital, and in a society which is characterised by global trends in the consumption and use of technologies, global fashions, and global consumption of entertainment. Now, that mission statement, I think, requires us to add two other functions to the mission of, or the job description of intellectual property. The first of those is that intellectual property, I think, has an additional function now for regulating competition or fair competition in an economy in which the centre of wealth creation is in fact intangible assets. And since innovation is the battleground for competition increasingly, and since intellectual property captures the competitive advantage of innovation, then intellectual property will become, as the former Prime Minister of China, Mr. Wen Jiabao, said, the basis of competition in the future. And that is a function that I think we need to be aware of. And I think the authenticity of the insight of Wen Jiabao can be seen both at the level of countries and at the level of enterprises. So let me give you some examples, if I may. First of all, with respect to countries, I think that what we see is a lot of competition for all amongst countries, for all of the elements or components that go into making a healthy or a good innovation ecosystem. So competition between countries for hosting R&D facilities, competition with respect to university league tables, where Melbourne does very well, and competition for human resources, especially. So in April this year in the United States of America, Mark Zuckerberg formed a new lobbying group called Forward.us or FWD.us. And the whole purpose of the lobbying group is to advocate immigration reform, specifically to attract the talent necessary to support innovation through, for example, a simpler track for foreign science graduates to obtaining residence, and an increase in the quota that they call H-1B visas. That's the visa available to specialised temporary workers. Now, the quota for H-1B, specialised temporary workers, visas in the United States of America is 65,000 this year, and it was sold out. It was fully taken in 5 days. And we've done a little bit of research on this also, and it's very interesting. 30% of Nobel laureates were residing outside their home country at the time of the award of the Nobel Prize. And if you look at the United States of America, 57% of the world's inventors who are residing outside their home countries are residing in the United States of America, actually. And there are 15 times more immigrant inventors in the United States than there are US inventors residing abroad. And they're about 20% of all inventors in the United States of America. Now, there's a darker side to state-state competition, and that is espionage, which also takes place, obviously, between enterprises. But you will have noticed that the intensity of the rhetoric with respect to espionage has been rapidly escalating in the recent past. So General Keith Alexander, who is the Director of the National Security Agency and the Commander of US Cyber Command, called the loss of industrial information and intellectual property through cyber espionage, quote, the greatest transfer of wealth in history, unquote. And something called the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property, which reported in April this year, said that the scale of international theft of American intellectual property is unprecedented, hundreds of billions of dollars per year, on the order of the size of US exports to Asia. And their principal recommendation, which you have there on the screen, was, their first recommendation was to designate the National Security Advisor as the principal policy coordinator for all actions on the protection of American intellectual property. So I noticed that Philip Noonan, who's the Director General of IP Australia, is sitting here tonight, and he also is going to have another job description, not just intellectual property, I think. You know, you might say that's exaggerated rhetoric, but the fact is that's the perception, and perceptions have a reality of their own. Now, in the enterprise sector, I think you get, again, a soft side and a dark side, a soft side and a hard side to the competition that we're seeing occurring with respect to intellectual property. The soft side is just the enhanced effort that's made by enterprises with respect to every facet of the innovation process, all stages across the design, production, marketing of goods and services. And the hard side, I think, can be perceived in the smartphone patent wars, the hard side of competition between enterprises and enterprises. So if you've seen what's happened in the last couple of years, companies have been building patent arsenals for the patent wars. So let me give you a couple of examples of what's happened in the last 3 years. A so-called Rockstar Group, which included Apple, Microsoft, Research in Motion and Sony, acquired the 6,000 patent portfolio of Nortel Networks for $4.5 billion. Google acquired Motorola Mobility, reputedly for its 17,000 patent portfolio, for $12.5 billion. Kodak sold its digital imaging portfolio of patents to a consortium of 12 licensees for $525 million. Microsoft sold 650 patents to Facebook for $550 million. And Hewlett-Packard acquired 1,500 mobile telephony patents from Palm for $1.2 billion. Now, there are probably multiple explanations for that behaviour, but I would simply notice the focus of competition sharpening on intellectual property and being expressed frequently through litigation. And in the litigation area, of course, you have a terrorist operating and doing a lot of collateral damage, which is the patent troll, or more politely, the patent assertion entity. As we know, the problem we have there, I think, is a problem of definition. It's very difficult to say where the legitimate evolution of technology markets with a healthy array of intermediaries stops and where harmful behaviour that puts innovation at risk commences. And it's very difficult to make that distinction. For example, the old term non-practicing entity doesn't apply because a university, which is a major patent player, is a non-practicing entity, actually. But what patent assertion entities share in common, of course, is an interest not in the underlying knowledge of the patent, but an interest in the exclusive right that is conferred. And it's that they use. And they're very active. For example, patent assertion entities, according to the White House, filed 61% of all new patent litigation in the United States in 2012, 61%. Okay, so let me turn to the other then function, in addition to this competition regulation function. And the second new function, I think, is IP as a mechanism for finding the social and economic equilibrium point amongst all of the interests, the very diverse interests that surround the acts of innovation and creativity in our society. So when the Irish king considered the issue that was brought before him, things were relatively simple. Two disputants, one hand-produced Bible. And admittedly, it had ramifications or implications for the whole monastic class, which was the literate class. But essentially, the readership in the largely illiterate society of the time was small and the impact was local. Now compare that with a decision today on the legality of a settlement between the publishers on the one hand and Google on the other hand, in relation to Google's plan to digitise all the books in the world. Or compare it to, I'm sorry I didn't show you that slide, I omitted it. That's a graphic representation which you're meant to absorb in 3 seconds of the smartphone patent wars. You can see the extent of litigation going on in that area. But back to, the weight of decisions that are taken about intellectual property. Here's a good example, not just the Google example, of course, but compare King Diarmuid's decision with a decision on the patentability of genetic information. And you see here, I thought that this was worth showing because it's the only time I've seen the Financial Times have as its headline a legal case, a court case. And not only a court case, it wasn't an English court case, it was actually an American Supreme Court decision, the Myriad decision on patenting DNA. And it gives you an idea, I think, of the increased importance resulting from those factors of which I spoke, the increased importance of intangibles, economic importance of intangibles, and the social engagement that you get in and around innovation. So, one of the functions, I think, of intellectual property now, of course, is to establish the equilibrium point in respect of all of the diverse interests that surround innovation or creation. So there's the interests of the individual as opposed to the interests of the individual in being rewarded, as opposed to, and the human rights provision, as opposed to society's interest in the knowledge or the new knowledge or the information, the interests of the producer as opposed to the consumer, the interests of encouraging investment in innovation as opposed to the interest in sharing the social benefit of the new innovation. And so it's a balancing act, really, that has to be performed for intellectual property. And I think it's increasingly anachronistic to think of intellectual property as standing for one set of interests only. In fact, its role is to reconcile all of these interests that occur in and around creation. Now, you might say that intellectual property has always played that role. In a certain sense it has. The design of the patent system is a bargain between an individual creator to disclose his or her invention in return for receiving exclusive rights. But I think the difference that you get now is that this balancing act needs to be performed at a much greater level of granularity than simply the design of the system. It's arising in respect of decisions time and time again, and legislatures or courts are having to find the equilibrium point time and time again. Now, I would be tempted to add a third new function for intellectual property, but I think it's not actually a new role for intellectual property, it's a new use of intellectual property, and I'd just like to mention it. It's intellectual property because it arises from the centrality of knowledge in the economy, and because of that centrality and the appreciation in the value of intangibles in the economy, what we find is that intellectual property is now used as a way of financing an increasing array of activities in the physical economy. And let me give you the example of sport in this regard. So what intellectual property does is it captures the commercial value of sport by monetising spectacle, image and reputation. So in sport, of course, without a spectacle you have nothing. But the means of monetising the spectacle is no longer really through ticket sales. You know, ticket sales are of interest in creating the atmosphere for the broadcast, which is the real way of monetising the spectacle. In the case of the International Olympic Committee, about 60% of its revenue is derived from broadcasting. And broadcasting, of course, the value of the broadcast depends on the capacity to control access to it. And intellectual property is, of course, the gatekeeper here that controls the access to the broadcasting. For the Beijing Olympics, for example, it's estimated that broadcasters paid $1.7 billion for the exclusive rights to broadcast the Olympics. In addition to spectacle, of course, there is image and reputation, which is monetised by intellectual property. So here is the captain of the Australian cricket team in 1948, and here is the captain of the Australian cricket team in 2013. And in case you think it's just Australia, you know, that is an English cricketer, you know, and if you think it's some sort of Anglo thing, that's an Indian cricketer, you know. So let me give you the example of Roger Federer. Roger Federer has earned $77 million out of prize winnings, but most of his money comes from sponsorships and endorsements. Last year, he signed a deal with Moët Chandon for $30 million. So $77 million for blood, sweat and toil, and $30 million for smiling. And it's reported that he also has deals with Rolex, with Mercedes-Benz, Nike, Wilson, Lindt, Chocolate, Dura, Gillette, Procter & Gamble, Credit Suisse and NetJets. And I think that, you know, that analysis that you have for sport, intellectual property, monetising spectacle and monetising, you know, reputation and image, you can apply to all spectacles. You can apply it to museums. They do that in a much lesser degree, for example. Theatrical performances, musical performances, and so on. So let me move on then, if I may, and talk about three questions that I think are going to be the main questions in this new environment for intellectual property, briefly. So the first question is, I'll call entitlement, you know, and that relates to the function, the new function of intellectual property as a regulator of competitive behaviour. And the other two questions I'll call appropriability and access. And they relate, the other two, to the other role of intellectual property as finding the equilibrium point of the various interests that surround innovation and creation. And of course, these questions, you know, demand much more attention than I'm able to give them here. I'll just run through them very briefly, if I may. Entitlement, first of all, it's an age-old question, of course. It's the question of whether Finian had the right of control over the illuminations on his Bible. It's who invented what first, whether someone has inspired themselves legitimately from another product or another design, or whether they have slavishly imitated it or copied it. And it's always been there as a question, but I think for three reasons, it's going to be a much more animated question in the future. And the first reason is the obvious reason of the enhanced value of intangibles. The second reason, I think, is the rise in the importance of espionage and the illicit appropriation of trade secrets and confidential information. So I think what's happened is that technology has enabled espionage on a widespread basis that was not possible previously. And that development has coincided with the rise in value of information and intangible assets. And at the same time, as I've indicated with respect to skilled workers, you have a global movement of skilled workers around the planet. And while that's not a form of espionage, of course, it does expose to vulnerability or increased vulnerability the intellectual assets of corporations and enterprises. And I think those developments underline the importance of that branch of intellectual property which is somewhat neglected, which is the protection of confidential information or trade secrets. And distressingly, worldwide, it's in very poor condition because the civil law traditions and the common law traditions approach the question entirely differently from a legal perspective. And it needs some attention, but it's very difficult to see how any attention can be given to that subject multilaterally, to promote secrecy in an age of transparency. That's a very hard sell. So, but nevertheless, it is a question that is, more and more data is being produced, which is of some value, and this is an important question, I think. And the third reason, I think, why entitlement is going to become more and more an issue is the silently growing tension between competition on the one hand and cooperation on the other hand. So I've outlined the developments with respect to competition, but of course, at the same time, what we see is that more and more enterprises are turning to the model of open innovation. That is, instead of satisfying their innovation needs through their own internal research and development programs, they are looking to partner and to cooperate with others in satisfying their innovation needs. And that tension, therefore, between competition on the one hand and cooperation is going to require a certain amount of regulation, and the defining issue in resolving that tension between cooperation and competition will be, of course, intellectual property, and that's why the recently retired president and CEO of IBM, Samuel Palmisano, said that intellectual property will become one of the key geopolitical issues of the 21st century. So now, so much for entitlement. I think a second cluster of issues and questions, new questions, will arise around the question of appropriability. And mindful of what Andrew says about saying dumb things, let me make it clear that I'm aware that appropriability is not a word, but let me use it if I may. It's the capacity to appropriate, and I think it covers two things: whether something should be appropriated and whether it can be appropriated, which are two different questions. Now, whether something should be the subject of an intellectual property right, whether it should be brought out of the public domain, I think raises questions that, in theory, are relatively clear. You only give intellectual property for something that's new, for something that's distinct, for something that hasn't existed before. But what we see with the merger of science and technology technology reaching back further into science, of course, is that the distinction between science and technology is becoming blurred. It's harder and harder to make a distinction between invention on the one hand, discovery on the other hand. And it doesn't just concern, I think, rights in technology. It concerns the whole trademark world. And let me give you one example, if I may. Here. So, I'm sure many of you will be aware that this is a pair of shoes designed by Christian Louboutin, and he claims a trademark on the red sole. The red sole on any shoe that is not coloured red. So do you think that you should be able to have a perpetual right over all shoes that are made with a red sole when the colour is not red? That's the question. Well, we tested it in Sydney last night. There were not many supporters, but a court in New York found, yes, it's a valid trademark, right? This particular one. And I think here, the challenge is going to be for the courts and for policymakers to ensure that they remain in touch with the public. That the decisions are not getting too much out of line with what the public thinks about these matters. Now, the other question, which is whether something can be appropriated, is an entirely different question. I think it arises from the arrival of technologies of perfect and efficient imitation, notably in the life sciences and digital technology. So what you have as a consequence of those, of course, is this enormous disjunction between, on the one hand, the cost of production, and on the other hand, the cost of reproduction. So industry estimates that to produce a new pharmaceutical, it's about $1 billion. But once available, this effect of the non-rivalrous nature of information, once available, it can be reproduced by a competent graduate student within 3 months at relatively little cost. To make a feature film, it's usually several hundred people, several $100 million, 12 months, even 24 months. But once it's made, it can be reproduced in a matter of seconds at zero cost, zero marginal cost, and distributed around the world. So that's a big drama for the system, actually, whether the system, whether you can appropriate things as the system says you can. And we're seeing that drama played out. And now let me mention the last issue, which I think is going to animate this area of the new environment of intellectual property, and that's the issue of access. Now, what intellectual property does, of course, is it makes access a saleable commodity, and so it enables technology markets. That's how you can have technology markets, because access is a saleable commodity. But precisely because it makes access a saleable commodity, you have some social unease about access, the lack of access and the price of access. And we've seen that play out with respect to biomedical inventions, pharmaceutical inventions, content on the internet, and to some extent climate change technologies, although I think the last area is more a theoretical debate than a practical one with full-scale political engagement. Now, I don't think that tension is going to subside. I think that for policymakers, the challenge is going to be how to orchestrate an informed and reasonable debate about these issues. And for corporations, the challenge is going to be how to strike a balance between, on the one hand, aggressive pursuit of competitive advantage that is given by intellectual assets and intellectual property on the one hand, and on the other hand, awareness of the possible social reaction that may come from having property rights over socially beneficial technologies. And of course, there is a paradox at work there, which is that nobody minds someone making $20 billion out of new social media, but there's widespread social unease about someone making a large amount of money out of a new life-saving drug. But what is the outcome that we want to encourage in our innovation system? Okay, now I think I've used my time, so I'm going to skip the last bit, but I've written something in the paper concerning the new environment for making policy, which I think has changed just as the environment for intellectual property has changed. But I want to leave you with one thought, if I may, and that's the following. if you were in the 18th century or the early 19th century, new wealth was being created in new ways and on a massive scale through physical capital and industrialisation. Now, the process of industrialisation spawned the great ideological debates and cleavages that shaped the world for the next 200 years. Capitalism, Marxism, socialism, communism. Now in the early 21st century, new wealth is being created in new ways and on a rather massive scale through intellectual capital and virtualisation. So I think that is what we are seeing in what I've tried to describe. We are seeing the contours or the outlines of the battle lines, I think, that are going to shape the debates in our society for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
We now have a good opportunity for questions and comments. We have microphones, so please wait until you have a microphone in your hand and then ask your question or make your comment. Perhaps I should have added you need to raise your hand to show you want to ask a question. Here we are, raise your hand.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, it was fantastic. But on the topic of access and globalisation and geopolitics, I wonder where WIPO sees itself in terms of using intellectual property as a means of trading wealth away from poorer countries to the wealthier countries where the IP is generated. And how big an issue is this for WIPO and what can WIPO do about this?
Well, look, thank you for the question. It's an enormous issue, obviously. It's an enormous issue. And I think that what we've seen, of course, is that there has been some evolution in this question. I mean, traditionally there is a north-south divide, a divide between the industrialised countries on the one hand and the developing countries on the other hand. And many in the developing world consider that intellectual property is a means of extracting, rents or wealth out of the developing world. And this is the reality of the perception that exists. Historically, internationally, one of the big events, of course, was the TRIPS agreement, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement that was concluded in 1994, in the World Trade Organization. And what happened then, really, if I can caricature the bargain that was at the basis of the Uruguay round of multilateral trade negotiations, it was this. We, the industrialised countries, will open our markets. The consequence of opening our markets is that jobs in the low technology, low skill area will be exported offshore, and we've seen that happen. But in return for that, you, in the developing countries, must protect the conceptual input to production, namely intellectual property. So typically, you might wear a shirt, if you're in Europe, which is designed in, say, Italy, and it bears an Italian trademark, but it is manufactured in Bangladesh or in the Philippines. So that's the sort of basis. Now, many in the developing world considered that the developed world did not deliver on all their promises of what intellectual property would bring them. And so it remains an issue of great tension, I think. But I'd like to think that we are slowly moving away from this north-south clear-cut divide. And it's, of course, very, very difficult because there's a lot of distrust that exists between the countries. And I think that what we have to do is to try to choose issues that you can try and get an international consensus around. So we've had 2 new multilateral treaties in the last 2 years. The first one was to include actors in the international intellectual property framework, and the second one was to improve access to published works for visually impaired and blind persons. So they were relatively easy causes to get a consensus around, you know. But it remains the case that in the patent area, it's very difficult to have any movement, because then you get this tension about intellectual property and north-south coming to the fore. But as I said, I'd like to think there is some movement and some change, and I think that we see an increasing number of the middle income developing countries in particular looking to move up the value chain, you know, looking to compete on a basis other than the cost of labour, you know, and in doing that, well, they have to turn to intellectual property. They're looking to add value. And so we're getting a better understanding, I think, that intellectual property can actually contribute to development.
Down the front.
You spoke about commoditising or monetising sports events and so forth and spectacles. Under Australian law, at least, there obviously isn't any intellectual property right as such that protects a sport event. It's copyright in the broadcast and so forth. A fairly glaring gap in that area, of course, is when there's a live broadcast which isn't recorded on the way through. Do you think that there should be some form of sui generis protection or some addition to copyright that provides protection in that sort of area?
Well, it's very interesting. Look, we have under negotiation a proposed treaty on broadcasting, and this, I know, doesn't answer your question entirely, but the proposed treaty on broadcasting, I mean, one of the things that it would do, if it is concluded, is to make it, well, for countries to take on board, that they have to establish, prohibit any unauthorised use of the broadcast signal. So any use of the broadcast signal on the internet, you know, of which there's a lot, would be prohibited. Now, that doesn't answer your question, because it doesn't stop me or you sitting in the sporting stadium with a camcorder or another device, recording it and publishing it on the internet, because we're not pirating any broadcast signal. We're creating one, actually. And for that, there is, as you rightly suggest, you know, a gap. But it's not a complete gap in the world. I mean, actually in Brazil, they have this, it's called Pelé's law, actually. And it's a right-in spectacle, if you like. And the other country that has come a little bit close to touching this is New Zealand. When they had the World Cup for rugby, when they hosted the World Cup for rugby, they passed legislation creating an association right. That is, an exclusive right of association. So, you know, ambush, you're familiar with ambush marketing, when you sit there and you have, you know, 5 people sitting in the 4th row of Wimbledon with an orange T-shirt and they have an advertisement on it. What the New Zealand legislation did is create an exclusive right to associate, you know, a person, an event, an image, a product with the sporting event. So I think we're seeing the beginnings of this happen, but it hasn't yet hit the international stage, and I think but it is a possibility of creating, I think the other country that has it is Spain, which has an exclusive right for spectacle in bullfights. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for a great presentation. I'd just like to talk about copyright. Yeah. One of the issues that it seems to me that you've been talking about is the role of governments around the world to optimise the public interest. They've got one set of tools which is available to them in the area of patents and designs and so forth, which is to charge the intellectual property owner to occupy the space under which they can then dictate and control other people's behaviour. And they pay for it. In the patents area, it's clear that you increasingly pay more and more if you want to continue to occupy this space over the years. In copyright, you can get it for free. It's virtually perpetual, particularly when you think about computer software. If it's the life of the creator plus 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and most of the copyright or the creators of that kind of copyright are probably 20 years old or so. So it's a very long time. Is that a concern to you, or is it something where you're happy to leave it as it is?
Look, I think that it's obviously a very, very important question, and I am constrained in the sort of answer that I can give because it was the subject of a Supreme Court decision in the United States of America, of course, the length of the copyright term and whether this was against the Constitution. I will talk around the question, if I may, rather than give you a direct answer. I think that the real challenge that we have in the copyright area is that we had this whole architecture for the analogue world. We had collecting societies, we had distribution networks. You can't go to a bookshop now, well, you can, but there's not many of them left. All this process of disintermediation that has occurred. So there's this major transition that we're going through of re-expressing that architecture of the analogue world in the digital world. And we're not there. It's clear we're not there. And one of the questions that is arising in all that is just how permanent is copyright, as you rightly, point out. What's the optimal length that we should have in this regard? And I think it's a really serious question. It's the question that's at the base of orphan works, for example. Orphan works are the works nobody can use them because we don't know who is the owner of the works because they've disappeared over this long period of time that you have described. So I think there's a growing consciousness of the need to look at this system and to see how it operates in the digital world, in the very fast-moving world. Of course, policy processes are slow, but I think that you ask an extremely pertinent question that is going to be, considered in the coming years.
Hello, I'm just a student and very new to IP and patents. But then I had this question. Do you think there should be regulation of things that could be said are IPs? Because when you just Google up things, there are some wackiest of patents that have been granted. So do you think that these should be regulated?
If I understand correctly, your question is about whether you should have patents over trivial inventions, is it? Not quite.
No, I mean, I want to know if IPs should be regulated as per their utility and purpose, and not just, everything should be granted.
I see, yeah. Look, I think it's very difficult to do what you suggest, okay? Because, let me put it this way. If we could understand the value of new inventions when they're created, then we wouldn't have a venture capital industry. Yeah. The fact is that the nature of information and knowledge is such that we don't know what its commercial impact is going to be like. So what the patent system does is it makes a best guess at that. It says, okay, it's got to be new. It's got to involve an inventive step, and it's got to be industrially applicable, more or less, So if new information fits into that category, we'll give it a property right. But then you have to go out and, make it work and sell it to the public. That's a different matter. But I think deciding in advance, not only good inventions get a patent right. I mean, it's theoretically a good idea, but the problem is we don't know what a good invention is until some years later when it's used in the market. And if we did, as I say, we wouldn't have a venture capital industry. We'd all be able to tell which ones to invest in.
Right. Yeah, thanks.
One more. We've got time for two questions. I can see one there and then there. So last two, thanks.
Sorry.
Hi, I was thinking about the fact that you were talking about a shift in skilled workers, and I personally, from a research point of view, know that that's in part due to the fact that you're paid differently depending on where you are in the world. But, obviously we've come a long way, but there are still clear disparities between intellectual property laws depending on which country. And I'm wondering, do you think we'll ever have a uniform legal system around the world that deals with IP, or do you think we will always have sort of quite large differences?
Yeah, look, I think you're actually, also getting a bit of competition in relation to intellectual property laws. So you might have noticed that in the UK, if I'm not mistaken, the Prime Minister has introduced a special tax provision that if the intellectual property is made or held in the UK, you pay tax at a lower rate, trying to attract, if you like, investment in intellectual property in the UK. So we're seeing that. But I think that the problem with, the essential problem that we've got is that there is a functional need for standardisation in globalised markets. In globalised markets, everyone would like their mobile telephone to work when they get off the plane, doesn't matter what country it is. And that can only happen through a certain amount of standardisation, because the latest generation of mobile phones, smartphones, have 50,000 patents in them, So there is a functional need for us to continue the sort of lifestyle that we have, for there to be standard laws around the world. But on the other hand, you get some developing countries saying, hold on, reserve this space for national, discretion. We want to, and the TRIPS agreement says that, we want to reserve decisions that affect public health, that affect agriculture, for example, that affect the environment. We want to reserve those for our decision, because essentially we don't trust the international, community to make laws that are good for us. So that's the tension you get between, there is a functional need for a uniform system, but there doesn't exist the trust in the world to establish such a system at the moment. So you get a long process of specific and technical additions to the international space, I think.
There was one other question up the back there. Thank you.
You said that one part of your lecture that you weren't able to deliver today addressed issues relating to the multilateral environment. I wonder if you might just share with us briefly what you see as the challenges of concluding multilateral agreements in the current international environment, and in particular, could you offer us some thoughts on what you see as the future relationship between WIPO and its family of agreements on the one hand, and the WTO, the TRIPS regime, agreements like ACTA, and the coverage of intellectual property and free trade agreements on the other?
Yeah, well, I would love to give you a long answer, but I'll try and truncate it, if I may. Look, I think that when you look around now, what you see is that there are very active IP agendas at the national level, at the bilateral level, at the plurilateral level, so bilateral and free trade agreements, plurilateral like Trans-Pacific Partnership or other plurilateral agreements where intellectual property is a big part, and then at the multilateral level. And I think that's a new feature of the environment for making policy. I think actually you have competition for international organisations and for multilateralism. So if you like, the things that international organisations were designed to achieve can now be achieved in a whole host of other ways, a whole lot of other ways of public-private partnerships, plurilateral arrangements, bilateral arrangements. So it's a very complex environment for making policy now, and in that, naturally, from where I'm sitting, I believe that it is important to maintain the relevance of multilateralism. But at the same time, we notice that the capacity of the international community to agree is extremely reduced. So in 2012, a grand total of 4 new multilateral treaties were concluded. Now, if you compare that to the Congress of the United States of America over the same period, it passed 284 new laws, and it was considered to be, the most unproductive on this measure, Congress, since 1948. So 4 multilaterally. And if you looked at those, one was the Beijing Treaty, another, our treaty, another was a Food Assistance Convention, which put together bits and pieces that already existed, and there were 2 protocols. So you don't have any capacity on the international community to agree at the moment. And there are lots of, theories of why that is the case. One big theory is the geopolitical shift that's going on in the world, so that that economic shift that we have seen has not expressed itself in the political architecture yet. Whatever, we have a very limited capacity to agree. And therefore, the Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations has not been able to conclude. We have done 2 agreements. Why did we have success, or the member states have success? I think that a large part of the explanation was because they were about specific and technical matters. So you can do an agreement on a specific and technical matter. You can't do an agreement on general and political matters. So you can do an agreement on mercury, but you can't do levels of mercury, but you can't do an agreement on climate change. That's the drama of the world at the moment, because at the same time, never has the need for international solutions been greater, because whether it's the movement of people or the movement of germs or the movement of pollution or the movement of arms or the movement of capital or the movement of ideas across borders, it's beyond the capacity of any one country to be able to deal with. So you do need the international cooperation. I think that's the drama we're living at the moment. As far as WIPO and WTO are concerned, well, what we're trying to do is to make progress, by the specific technical areas we have coming up, we hope, designs, traditional knowledge, broadcasting, and taking them one at a time, trying to disconnect them from any other IP agenda and disconnect them from any other multilateral agenda and make progress on them. I think the drama for the WTO, and I have to be very careful about our colleagues there, but the drama is that they have the so-called single undertaking. That it's an agreement on everything. And that's a very difficult thing to achieve in this complex environment, as opposed to an agreement on a particular thing. You've got to agree services, you've got to agree, non-trade tariff barriers, you've got to agree agriculture, you've got to agree, right across the field. So it's very difficult now to put that all together. And so they have not made progress in terms of new agreements recently in the intellectual property field. Yeah. So, but it's a long and interesting subject.
Thank you. I now invite to the podium Jennifer McEwen, who's a member of the Council of IPTA, to bring our proceedings to a close.
Do you want me to go and sit down? Stay.
On behalf of IPTA, I would like to thank Francis for addressing us tonight at this annual and prestigious lecture which bears his name. IPTA is very proud to have been a major sponsor of this lecture since its inception 5 years ago. The rapidly growing awareness of the value of IP in our society is evidenced by the strong attendance here tonight. Tonight, Francis has talked to us about change in the IP landscape and innovation landscape. He's talked to us about the growing recognition of its importance and massive investment by companies, leading to the increasing value of intangible assets on the balance sheet. Secondly, he's talked about the apparent seismic shift of the geography of innovation to the Asian region. He's also talked to us about the increasing openness of the innovation system by the sharing of knowledge, which has been facilitated by the internet and social media. And finally, and very importantly, he's talked to us about the increase and rise of cyber espionage and the theft of IP knowledge. Tonight's presentation has been both stimulating and challenging, and most typical of Francis's approach to the rigors of intellectual property. As head of WIPO, Francis has been at the forefront in seeing and thinking about how IP might develop, not on an insular country-by-country level, as many intellectual property practitioners tend to take as victims of the vicissitudes of their own country's legislation, but rather Francis is able to rise above that insularity and see a global approach to IP, and that is something we should all welcome and be very proud that an Australian is able to lead the way in such a high-profile sphere. I do wish Francis every success for the remainder of his term as Director General, and can I ask you again to join with me to thank Francis for his presentation tonight.